So, going from a near future into a big step forward now.
A very distant future.
Yes, indeed, with our next writer who is ready and waiting in the waiting room. I know this is a writer that you worked with during the edit, so I'm sure you're going to have plenty to say on this. So, yes, please go on
I'll
ahead.
start with the intro.
Yes, I
With the
shall.
intro.
I shall put you forward into intro mode.
Okay, so we're now going to give you a little intro and reading from What We Do Know How to Do, which is a sort of dystopian sci-fi story or climate fiction story written by Anneliese Schultz. This is a story about a young couple who become the unlikely and, I think by their own admission, unprepared governors of a ghost town. The meat of the story involves them brainstorming how they're going to bring life and community back to this very desolate, abandoned place, this very ruined place. So I'm going to read you a little taster of that story now. So, our grandparents, their fault basically. It was all their manufacturing and amassing, consuming and wanting and grasping that built the seemingly perfect but already compromised habitat into which our parents were born. A tower already tipping, climate and every other kind of chaos on its way. Well, yes, and enough said about these unknowing and yet, beyond a shadow of a doubt, guilty ancestors. For we knew and loved them, and it is simply too sad. Hi, good to see you.
You too.
And very nice to chat to you after collaborating on your story, which I absolutely love. You may know, because I think maybe I've got a feeling that before we came together over collaborating over this anthology, we may have been in some of the same sci-fi groups online. I think there's a few on Facebook where I see your name crop up a lot in those groups, and it was probably through me sharing the competition, those groups that you maybe became aware of the contest itself.
Right. It was one of the climate fiction or sustainability groups. Yeah.
So I wanted to kick things off by just talking, because sci-fi is still a genre which, while it's becoming very, a very hot genre at the moment, I think there was just a few weeks ago, there was a big article about sci-fi being an emerging genre in The Guardian. It's still something that often when I bring it up and say the word sci-fi or climate fiction, a lot of people want a bit of a definition, a bit of background into what it is. So as a fellow sci-fi writer, do you want to talk about how you came into the genre and what it is you love about writing in this genre?
Well, it's interesting. I just saw the other day that the word sci-fi was apparently someone came up with it in 2008, or 2009, and it's 2008 that I started writing sci-fi. So that's quite interesting.
You were writing it before you knew what it was called.
Yeah. And that was because, well, I was teaching Italian at UBC here in Vancouver, and I had read the 2008 or skimmed the 2008 IPCC report and was completely shocked by everything that was in it. I'd always, been an activist for the environment back in college in the States where I'm from. I fought against nuclear power plants and so on. But I realized that reading that, I was feeling really depressed, and my answer to depression is acting, doing something. So I actually did three things. I made my courses into green Italian, incorporating sustainability into the curriculum. I, having also read your compatriot George Monbiot's book, Heat, How to Stop the Planet from Burning. The moment I finished reading the chapter on air travel, I stopped flying for good. And the third thing was I started writing my climate fiction novel. It's interesting that after maybe 5 years, so 5 or 10 years ago, all my fiction became cli-fi just because that's our reality. I mean, we are in a climate changed world. So when I was first writing that first novel, I set it way, way out there. And I've since in revisions had to actually layer in more disasters because the things that I came up with in my mind were actually happening, which is a little distressing. But so this story, what we do know how to do, I didn't even really think of as cli-fi. It's just that's my normal setting now. Everything is in a climate changed world. And because of that, you know, in the story, all the infrastructure is down, there are abandoned towns and so on.
And let's just go into what we're going to ask next. Yeah, so you mentioned George Monbiot. It's one of those, he was a huge influence for me as a non-fiction writer, to sort of harness those ideas of the real world impacts of climate change. And I think you probably do the same thing as me, in the sense that I also find you start writing about something and you think you're writing about this extreme dystopian concept of climate change in your climate fiction, and then a few years later it's actually happening for real. And it's like it's constantly, if you read those non-fiction books, like people like George Monbiot and Naomi Klein, who are writing about these issues and predicting what's going to happen, you will be dealing with things that will soon become a reality. And your story feels like it's very much on the cusp of that. It feels like it's a good blend of you know, what's already been happening, and in a way it feels like it's been a very, in your story, it's been a very fast breakdown of society, which again feels like something that couldn't happen. But then obviously we've just had the COVID crisis, which has brought about a very radical change to the way we live, and something which feels very dystopian for a lot of people. So to get into the story itself, I wanted to talk first about as people garnered from the extract I read, that you have like this very arresting, very literary style of prose. Your prose it's quite fragmented but very evocative, and it paints this picture for me, which is sort of like not just a visual picture, but like a tonal and emotional picture. So what influences do you have as a prose writer? What sort of, how have you developed that prose voice?
I'm not sure. All I can say is that my mentors in terms of what I've read are, well, going way back to Kenneth Roberts, who probably no one knows anymore, historical fiction, US historical fiction, but just one of the best writers I've ever read. Ray Bradbury, not so much because of the sci-fi, but just his writing is extraordinary. Barbara Kingsolver, I kind of have to look over at my bookshelf library here. Ivan Doig, I would say, is one of the best writers, American writers ever. So I've always loved beautiful prose. And someone in my writers group the other day said, I believe it, I'm not sure if it was a quote from Toni Morrison or about her work, but they said something about sentences that you can live on for a week. I just love that.
I love that.
Reading,
and you heard you can.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where I want to write sentences out again, you know, and I think a lot of contemporary work, I don't see anything that I want to just hold on to in the sentences.
It is really like, it's finding, I think that a piece like yours, which is very philosophical, I think you do need those sentences, and you have several throughout the piece, which really just sort of have that gut punch impact, where it's just like crystallizes everything in just one sentence. And for the rest of it, I think, like I say, you do paint this fabulous picture, not only of like sort of these abandoned towns and this sort of slow deterioration of society, but also the emotional impact of the couple who are living through this, and a couple who are sort of a young couple at the beginning of their life, feeling like they're at the end of something and trying to find this new beginning in something that feels like the end of society.
Right. Yeah, and they're actually, they just sort of happen upon this town, and this old man offers it to them for $1. And actually, initially for them, that's not this wonderful thing, because he says, it's perfect for your whole community. And they look at each other thinking, we have no community anymore. We don't know where anyone is. Everybody's been holing up here and there. There's no cell phones. There's no infrastructure whatsoever. So that's really what they have to think through, is can we even gather people anymore? And how do we do that?
Which is a very interesting tone to be writing about after the year and a bit that we've just had, which has all been about isolation and the breakdown of community in a way, and having to rely on things like technology. But obviously, your story is set in a time where even technology is broken down, so you don't have those tools of internet communication. It's all a bit more desolate and apocalyptic. Right.
And I wrote it, well before the pandemic.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. Something else I was going to say about that. So also, since there's no infrastructure in terms of cars or buses or anything, in order to get any community together at all, they're going to have to walk from this town, Sandon, which actually exists in BC, a ghost town. They're going to have to walk from there back to Vancouver to see if they can find anyone. And that's a very long way. That's at least a few days, weeks, maybe. I'm not sure.
It has this feel of pilgrimage to it, and that sort of it's like it's got those old traditions of sort of community and almost like and communism, like the idea of like bringing people together that we're all going to help each other survive, which I really liked. I was going to ask about particularly the main characters in this. Now, one thing I found very interesting about your story is it's got this abstract style to it, but also it's the main characters. They're a young. We know they're a young couple, but you kind of the narrator is nameless, and their partner is referred to only as beloved. And we don't get an actual name other than this nickname for them either. And they're both, I think I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure they're both genderless characters as well. And you might make an assumption that they're boyfriend girlfriend, but they could be a queer couple. We don't know. Was there a sort of like thought behind that to make them sort of these sort of slightly indistinct figures that maybe the reader could project upon?
Well, it's interesting. I always thought of beloved as a woman, but the narrator, I never thought one way or another about the gender, and I realized that well after writing it, and thought, I'm just going to leave it that way. What does it matter? Yeah. I mean, the important thing is the relationship between them, which I think is brought up many times as being something that became quite unusual in our society, to be so close to each other. But it was like, I wish I had the quote in front of me, something like a moment of grace that they were able to have this kind of relationship.
Absolutely, because in such a kind of grim setting, you need that sweetness, and there is a genuine sort of sweetness, and because it is this feeling of a first love, it's something that brings hope to the story, because it's like, well, this is something new and it's something passionate that's going to keep them going, and as long as they have each other, they will have like ambitions, they will have dreams, they will like want to build build this community that they're setting out to do together, and that sort of it sort of breathes a sense of hope into this very desperate dark setting.
Yeah, I find it's the same in my climate fiction novel, which started out as the one I started in 2008 called Distant Dream, and it's gone through so many changes. It's now called After the World, thanks to my son for coming up with that title.
I'm going to
And,
talk about your son later.
and that I was able to write. I mean, it's pretty scary too, to think of everything being gone. And then the main character's little sister runs away into this devastation. So she has to go out and find her. But the way I was able to write it was because it's from the point of view of a 15-year-old with the hope inherent in the heart of a young person.
Mm. So is that what draws you to writing particularly YA climate fiction? Is all your climate fiction with a bit of a YA bent with the young protagonists?
That's the only YA I've written. I've just finished a middle grade novel, and it's completely different, although it's automatically set in a very,
I am
very
going to ask about the
future.
middle grade novel as well, because just the synopsis of this is like, I must read this.
Yeah, so it's very near future, but it's also just assuming climate change.
Yeah, as you say, it's one of those things where it's like, we don't even, if you're doing anything futuristic based at the moment, I think you can't really leave climate change out, because it's already happening and it's already projected to get worse. So it's one of those things, if you haven't written it into the story, you need to have written some kind of, techno fix or something that we've done, if it's not actually happening. In any kind of futuristic story. So I completely agree with you that climate fiction is no longer just like a sort of speculative idea. It's now, it's part of what's happening, not only in contemporary, not only in futuristic fiction, but contemporary fiction as well.
Right.
I was going to ask you a little bit, going back to the sort of YA aspect in this story. I really like how you characterize the main couple as sort of a generation that has to, the title of the story is it the things that, I'm forgetting
what we do know how to do.
What we do know how to do. And it's very much focused on this generation that's relied on tech for everything, and relied on having a world that is like very virtual and very much where they don't need to learn basic life skills. And I love the way they start to think about, if they feel a bit helpless in this world they've been shown into. And I love, there's a little moment where I think it's beloved sort of talks about like, oh, when I was a little girl I knew how to sew, and could that be helpful? And so I was wanting to sort of get your sense of, like, as someone who has a young son and is in touch with that generation that way, about whether you kind of still feel like young people are passionate about learning like real life skills, not just how to use their technology.
I think it's going very much more back to that. Even when I was teaching, I had students who were, excuse me, in knitting clubs and certainly people into gardening, which I never learned as a child, even in my generation, never had any idea how to do any gardening. I'm finally doing some now. But I think, there's much, we're going towards young people realizing that they want to be much more hands-on.
I think actually I've encountered, because I work with young people, and a lot of them have talked about learning new skills that are like practical skills, and it's partly being driven by the pandemic and by lockdowns, that they've been so stuck indoors. And it's got to the stage where they're actually sick of the screens. They're actually wanting to do something that gets them away from that. I think once it becomes this thing where it's like, that's all you have, you suddenly like, you think, what, they want to get outdoors and do things outdoors and connect with life in a more hands-on way, especially when, suddenly everything's come back down to Zoom. Which I'm very aware of at the moment. I'm currently in another self-isolation stretch. So it's one of those things I'm very aware of. Going back to, again, the younger generation, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your son, who I believe is a musician. And it sounds like you use him quite a lot as a test reader at times, and as someone you go to for feedback. There is an amazing photo of you and your son on your website. The website you linked, is it the what's it called, Laughing in the Language. And there's a lovely photo which looks like you two at some kind of music festival, and it looks like you're having the best time. It looks like you're just absolutely, like, you know, loving the outdoors and the atmosphere of wherever you are. And so I was wondering if you talk a little bit about that relationship with a son who is also a creative person himself.
Right. That was actually, that photo is at, it was at the Blessed Coast Festival, which was a music and art and meditation festival that he organized for 7 years, I think, starting when he was 21. Yeah,
Wow.
so it was extraordinary. It was here in BC. So much on his shoulders, though, to do that. So I'm glad he's doing his own music now. His dad's a poet, so he comes by all of this naturally, poet and prose. Yeah, we're also writing together. We're writing a picture book together, which was based on a true story of a stowaway cat on a train when I was traveling from here to Colorado by train, which I did over 30 times over the last few years because I'd stopped flying and needed to go visit and take care of my mom. She passed away last year at 99, so I'm really glad that, you know, 3 times a year I took off on the 3-day train ride down there. But I knew the stowaway cat story had to be written, and Kala said, oh, it has to be in rhyme. And I'm like, no, absolutely not. If rhyme isn't done well, it's excruciatingly bad. But he's a rapper as well. So I think we nailed the rhyme. Yeah.
Fantastic. I love that collaboration between, like, you know, parent and child. I think that's fantastic, especially if you can bring different skills to the table and, you know, work together to your advantage. That's fantastic. I was going to close off now. I think we've only got about another 5 minutes before we need to get ready for the next writer coming in. But because we've covered your story in our anthology quite well, I wanted to dedicate the last few minutes to talking about what other projects you have. And I particularly really wanted to ask you about this middle grade novel, which is described on your website as a diverse step family that is beset by rude ghosts. And that just sounds so much fun. So, because your climate fiction, again, well, it's got a definite hopeful sort of center to it. It does focus on quite a grim world. Would you say that this middle grade novel is sort of is it sort of a nice relief? Is it to write something a bit more light-hearted?
Yes, yeah, it was great to write it. The first line just came to me in the middle of the night one night, and I just went with it. My son is a wonderful mix of Punjabi, so Indian, Swedish, German, English, Scottish. And so this is a diverse step family. The mom and the daughter are American, and then the new father and stepfather and stepbrother are from India. So it was really wonderful for me to be able to write that because I lived in Kala's Punjabi grandmother's household when he was little. Yeah, the family moves from San Francisco to Mississippi. The little girl is so upset about moving, which I only realized 3 years after writing it. Oh yeah, we moved constantly when I was little. Gee, that got in there too. I'd make one friend and we'd move somewhere else. But she is the only one who can hear them. She realizes bit by bit that they've moved. They move initially to Jackson, Mississippi, and then all of a sudden they move out into the country, no Wi-Fi, nothing. And she realizes it's because there were issues with her dad being brown and getting, her mom just not being able to take what was going on in Jackson. Um, but the ghosts that Sally is hearing are prejudiced and are calling her stepbrother a Hindu voodoo misfit. And so she ends up, pretty much having to take on the ghosts, although there's a grandfather that comes into the picture and actually knows these ghosts from back when.
From this generation, are they?
Yeah, they're actually, it turns out they're actually characters from a book that was never published. And they never got heard, and they're really wanting to be heard. But I am working on a new novel about, and it's interesting because I'm sure that it's an adult literary novel, but it's about a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old who run away from this world the way it is right now. So
and you can't blame them.
Yeah. And they say never to write, for adults with young characters,
and yet a load of people have done it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't think there's any problem with that. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what you do next. Definitely, I will be looking out for that middle grade novel and see what you do. Anneliese, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for talking through your stories and what you're going to be doing in the future. And yeah, and I will be looking out for it, and I will see you on the Cli-Fi forums.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.